said there were 2 reasons why gun rights shouldn't be limited to hunting. You only mentioned the Second Amendment. What other reason did you have in mind?
Using the Second Amendment as the sole defense of a principle implies the assumption that if it is in the Constitution, it must be right or true, which essentially places the Founding Fathers in a position of being worshipped as a source of truth.
Which doesn't seem like a very solid argument in support of an idea.
Agreed, but I don't see ideas as being true just because they're in the Constitution, but exactly the reverse.
That they are in the Constitution because they are true?
Yes, and not everything that made it into the Constitution was right or true. Think about the 3/5 Compromise, for example. So we have to look beyond the wording in the Constitution to the principles and ideas behind those words to see if they are based on truth.
And the 3/5 Compromise was based on the idea that slaves weren't equal.
Exactly. But the whole purpose of the Constitution in the first place was to create a limited government through checks and balances in the system. It was to be a country where the power was invested in the citizens themselves. And while they would delegate some of that power to their representatives in Washington, the final check in the system, to balance against potential government overreach, was the power of the armed populace.
To overthrow the government?
If necessary.
Isn't that a little far-fetched?
Not at all. Remember, the writers of the Constitution had just led a successful rebellion against the most powerful empire in the world.
But isn't that a bit unrealistic now, with the US military being the most powerful force in history? No group of armed citizens has a chance.
What about the Bundy Ranch standoff? If it wasn't for armed militias coming to his physical defense, Clive would have never even had his day in court.
That seems like a bit of a corner case.
Quite the contrary. It demonstrated to numerous federal agencies that there were segments of the U.S. population that weren't going to stand for their bureaucratic overreach without a fight. It only takes a few incidents like that to cause major changes in the way that government operates.
Are you sure you aren't exaggerating the impact it has on the government's approach?
Let's look at the crisis in Venezuela.
How was that related?
Well, it shows us what happens when you have a failed government ruling an unarmed population.
What do you mean, failed government? Who is to say that Maduro isn't the rightful leader?
Regardless of who the rightful leader is, the government has failed. Its citizens lack food, water, and electricity. Hugo Chavez banned private gun ownership in 2012. So now, without guns, the Venezuelans are out in the streets throwing rocks at government soldiers who are shooting at them with guns and running them over with vehicles.
But if both sides had guns, it would just be an all-out bloodbath.
There is great power in deterrence.
What do you mean?
Authoritarian governments wouldn't even attempt some of their more oppressive measures if they had a healthy fear of the resistance of their citizens. Those types of actions are only taken when those in power believe they can get away with it, because no one has the power to stop them. An armed populace has the power to stop anything if the people are united against it. That is an important part of freedom and a necessary check on government overreach.
But do we really need that risk of violence in the US, where we have other means of influencing the government?
Imagine what would happen if Congress suddenly repealed the Second Amendment. Do you think you would see armed protesters in the streets the next day?
Yes, a lot of people are pretty possessive of their guns.
That right there is an example of the benefit of government fearing its citizens. There would be nothing illegal or unconstitutional about repealing the Second Amendment, but Congress fears the obvious outcome, so no one even proposes something so radical.
But they still propose all sorts of other limits on guns.
Yes, but the mere presence of an armed populace is having a slowing effect on how they go about governing change, which is exactly the dynamic the founders were trying to create. The growing power of government comes at the expense of the freedom of its citizens, which is why I am in favor of an armed populace to promote individual freedom.